John, good to see you again. And thank you for what you explained about the progress that has been made in terms of the US-India technology partnership with ICET. And as you mentioned, ICET has been one of the very important transformational initiatives that has been taken for the bilateral relationship. And you've been here also for the intersessional assessment of the ICET process. Based on what you've said, a lot of progress has been made. But what do you see as the continuing challenges in taking this process further? And some of the hesitation in the US system, in the bureaucracy in general, about sharing higher level technologies with India, has that been adequately addressed?
Thanks for the question. So I would say that there are challenges in both systems, frankly, with trying to establish a pioneering partnership in an area of that will be so consequential to the future in multiple ways. Consequential to future prosperity in both India and the United States, and frankly, consequential to the national security of the United States and India. These are not always areas that lend themselves easily to cooperation and to collaboration, and it requires a great deal of trust building in order to get to the point in which collaboration can bring forward this agenda in both countries. We think we have broken down many of the barriers that traditionally have existed in our system and in India's to get to a point where even on the most cutting edge areas of technology, on semiconductors, on issues like artificial intelligence and quantum computing and space, we can work together in ways that advance our technology agenda, India's technology agenda, and create new technologies that will broadly benefit the world. Again, that requires enhancing and building a great deal of trust in the relationship on a personal level, on a government-to-government level, and on addressing some of the issues, whether they are regulatory or bureaucratic, that have held back cooperation in the past. We're committed to this agenda. We believe our Indian counterparts are committed to this agenda, and we're going to keep moving it forward.
You spoke about building trust in the relationship, and clearly trust will develop as we develop a habit of cooperation. And if you just look at the evolution of the US-India relationship over the past couple of decades, trade has become consequential, not as large as the US-China trade, but still $200 billion, increased by some 15 times in the last 20 years. Huge investments and flows in both directions. Growing size of the Indian origin diaspora community in the US. So from the US perspective, when you look at your broader national security concerns and challenges in the global context, what is the salience that you see for the India relationship?
So what I would say about this is a few things. First, I think the United States and India have a complicated history. We have not always been wholly aligned. We have not always found it easy to work together as economic partners. We have not always found it easy to be on the same side of issues geopolitically. And I think in some ways the most important step forward for the United States and India is recognizing on each side that there is much more that connects us than that divides us. And that does not mean, by the way, that we will agree on everything. There are many difficult issues that remain in this relationship, right up to the present day. But what we have demonstrated, I think, throughout the course of not just this administration, I will acknowledge, this is a bipartisan effort that has gone back many administrations in the United States, and frankly, many administrations in India, to bring us to the point where not only can we seize some of the important opportunities that the world presents for us, geopolitically and economically, but we can work through our differences in a constructive way without derailing that broader cooperative agenda. And that second part, in many ways, is just as important as the first.
And, you know, India's history is different, geographic location is different. So US and India, as you indicated, will not necessarily agree on all issues. Do you believe that now we have a mechanism and a habit of managing our differences much better? Like, for example, the difference on the Russia-Ukraine issue.
So what I believe is that the United States and India have established a mature relationship. And that mature relationship enables us, as I said, to identify opportunities that are in our mutual interest and pursue them. And we're doing that in any number of ways, through fora like ICET, through the Quad, and through any number of other areas in which we partner. It also allows us to work through areas of difference. On Russia-Ukraine, I think it's much more complicated than just purely an area of difference as you described. I think there are aspects of the conflict on which we very much agree. There are aspects that we see differently. That's true with any number of complicated geopolitical issues. no two countries are going to be perfectly aligned, including countries with issues and histories and cultures as strong and in some ways as different as the United States and India. But one thing that we have demonstrated is even on the issues that are the most challenging in our relationship, we can work through them constructively and get to a better place.
Speaking of the US relationship with China, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan has spoken now of competition in an age of interdependence, and a new approach to China in a sense of a phase of intensified competition started in the Trump administration. And the Biden administration in the initial phase continued with that, built upon that, imposed additional technology restrictions related to China. But since then, you've spoken of a small yard, high fence, de-risking, not decoupling. There have been several cabinet-level meetings, visit of US cabinet officials, and now President Xi and President Biden have had a meeting. So how are you looking at the prospect of the US-China technology competition in the years to come?
So you mentioned our predecessors, the Trump administration. What I would say is the Biden administration has borrowed elements from each of our two most recent predecessor administrations. From the Obama administration, in which I served, I think the Biden administration has borrowed a strategic focus on Asia. The Obama administration was the first to put in its seminal strategic documents, its national security strategy, its national defense strategy, a strategic focus on the Indo-Pacific, a strategic focus this administration very much shares. And from the Trump administration, as you identified, the Biden administration has borrowed, and we think the Trump administration was correct in identifying this, competition as a fundamental aspect of the framework through which we view the US relationship with China. So how have we tried to carry that forward? I can point to a few ways in which we've tried to do that. First, this competition has been extended to a number of aspects of our relationship, including on emerging and critical technologies, including on military dimensions of our relationship, including on other dimensions of our economic relationship, and including on our view of the geopolitical system that best serves our partners, our allies, and the world. These are all areas in which the United States and China are not fully aligned and won't be. But the United States has also made a priority, and I think this is important because it's a priority that India seems to share in its relationship with China, not to allow that competition to tilt or veer in the direction of conflict between the United States and China, which would not be in the interest of the United States or of China or, frankly, of the wider world. How do we manage that competition? You talked about an increasing pace and intensity of diplomacy that you've seen over the course, certainly of the last several months, with a number of high-profile American visitors to China, from our Commerce Secretary to our Treasury Secretary to our Climate Envoy to our Secretary of State, and then culminating most recently in the summit that took place in San Francisco between the President of China and the President of the United States. We think that this diplomatic contact is both responsible and important in managing what is, in many ways, a critically important relationship for the world that we have to get right. And we think that the diplomacy that we have undertaken in recent months has not in any way inhibited our competitive agenda and allowed us to, in some ways, ensure that it doesn't veer in a direction that would be detrimental to us, to China, and to the world.
So one of the reasons when you speak of conflict is concern related to what's happening in, let's say, South China Sea, where there are reports of recurrent Chinese ships trying to hinder movement of US ships, as you define it, through international waters, hinder movement of US aircraft. There have been joint US and Philippines patrols now being talked of in the region. So following the President Xi, President Biden meeting, is your expectation of some change in that behavior pattern or a new framework of interaction between US and China?
One thing I've learned not to do in this business is to make predictions, and certainly not predictions about how another country is likely to behave or not. But what I will say is you're right that we've got real concerns about some of the more coercive activity that we see China undertaking in the South China Sea and, frankly, in other parts of the world. We raise those issues very directly with our Chinese counterparts in all of our diplomatic engagements. We talk about those issues, importantly, with our partners and allies who share those concerns with us. And we stand for a set of principles and will continue to stand for a set of principles that include that no country should be able to coerce another by force, that international law and international norms should be respected. That will remain at the core of our foreign policy agenda and remain at the core of the agenda that we raise with China when we decide it's necessary.
There seems to be some tension between the shorter-term interests of the business community in the US and longer-term articulation by the policy community, the administration, people in Congress. We've seen, for example, the CEO of a leading semiconductor company speaking about 28% of their sales being in China, and their inability to do the $4 billion research they do in semiconductors if they're not able to sell to China, and then requesting a different approach in terms of technology partnership with China. But yet, from administration and also from Congress, there is talk of the longer-term strategic challenge from China. So how do you see this tension being handled in your policy framework?
You know, I guess my own sense would be whatever gaps there are between policies and approaches the business community might prefer and the policy approach that our administration or any other administration would take or has taken toward China, that those gaps are actually much smaller now than they have been in the past. And certainly than they were in the last time I was in government, now a number of years ago before the Biden administration. And that, frankly, reflects, I think, a number of the approaches taken by the PRC towards the international business community. And again, much of this comes down to steps that veer in the direction, including inside China, of a more coercive approach to the international business community, which raises concerns for them, concerns that we then are able to raise on their behalf, and frankly, less of a gap between the United States and China, between the United States and our business community than existed in before, and a high degree of alignment on some of the concerns that I've articulated.
Starting with the Trump administration and then continued in the Biden administration, there has been shift in the approach towards international economic engagement by the United States. The Trump administration walked back from some of the trade agreements that were done by the Obama administration. And of course, President Biden has also stayed away from that, including issues related to tariffs. There's been talk of onshoring of production. There's talk of industrial policy for the US. The National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, has spoken of foreign policy for the middle class, or there being a symbiotic relationship between domestic policy and foreign policy. And you've had the CHIPS Act, Inflation Reduction Act. So going ahead, how are you looking at US domestic policy choices and priorities impacting on your foreign policy choices, different from what may have been 6 or 7 years ago?
I guess one way I think about the difference is that there is a previous era in American international economic policy that almost prioritized principles like free trade as an end in and of itself. And I think the way that we think about international economic policy is a bit different. We think about it in terms of what type of domestic economy does the United States want to have and want to build. A domestic economy that prioritizes not just growth, but growth that is spread more equitably across a broader swath of the American population. Not just commercial success in the United States, but commercial success that values and lifts up the role of organized labor in our country. And frankly, we think that those approaches are better, not just because they build a stronger economy that positions us better in the world, but that they also position us better for an economy and an approach that is more broadly supported by a cross-section of the American people, which is quite important if you're trying to implement an international economic approach. On the international side, our objectives are also broader. Again, not just trade for trade's sake, but an international economic approach that lifts up, prioritizes, and allows us to advance our national security interests, whether those are more resilient supply chains, or leading the world in the critical technologies that will enhance our national security going forward, like some of the areas that we spoke about. And by the way, if you look at things like growth and trade flows, we think we can do this without compromising in those areas as well.
One of the criticisms that has often been made of US policy is that the way your politics is structured, the private sector clearly has an important role to play, and there's a lot of focus on policies, growth driven initially by the private sector. and then looking at trickle-down effects. And as a result, US has not quite paid the same level of attention to developing countries, or what is now being referred to increasingly as the global south. This has given space to your competitors, including China, to move into that space. So going ahead, do you see a change in US approach and how it is looking at the concerns, needs of the global south, so that you don't leave space, continue to leave space open to your competitors there?
So this is something that's been a real priority for this president, President Biden, and for our entire administration for a number of years. And I can talk about a few areas in which we've tried to advance this work. One is the development of these alternative economic frameworks that we have championed. IPEF in the Indo-Pacific, a framework called APEP, the America's Partnership for Economic Prosperity in our own hemisphere. These institutions and these policy frameworks are intended to do exactly what you just described. Address the economic needs, the concerns in an affirmative way of our partners in the Global South. I would point also to the G20 meeting that was hosted right here in India a number of months ago. During that conversation, you had a broad set of activities that took place, including a statement that was issued by the G20 countries that frankly reflected a much higher degree of alignment between the United States and the G20, including members of the G20 from the Global South, than did some of our competitors. It showed the United States standing up alongside a number of key countries, including India, to stand for reform of the multilateral development banks and other international financial institutions in ways that advantage both, we believe, our national security and our agenda, as well as the agenda of many key Global South countries by enabling, for example, middle-income countries to benefit more broadly from development finance. So we have tried to pioneer a number of areas that we think are appealing. On geopolitical issues, it will always be a contested space, and we think we're doing quite well in that regard too. If you look at the Russia-Ukraine conflict, which is often held up as an area of division between the United States, Europe, and some of the countries of the Global South, the number of countries that have voted time and time again to condemn Russian aggression in the United Nations General Assembly and ask that territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine be respected is overwhelming. And that has been the case now for almost 2 years.
So John, one final question. You've had a varied career, and among the things that you've done, you've also worked as a journalist in Iraq. And Iraq very often is held up an example of failed US policy. Something that also distracted US from Afghanistan, leading, as many have commented, that the US took 20 years to replace the Taliban with the Taliban in Afghanistan, and also seen as a failed approach towards regime change. And of course, we've seen the violence in Iraq leading eventually to the rise of ISIS. So your career as a journalist in Iraq, how is that impacting on the work you're doing now as the Principal Deputy National Security Advisor and the kind of choices that you would recommend for foreign policy making?
So I'm certainly not going to sit here and defend the invasion of Iraq or the fact that the United States stayed militarily in Afghanistan, according to the president I serve, far longer than we should have. Those were decisions made by previous administrations that are best left for history to judge. But what I guess I would say my time as a journalist, including in conflict zones, has done in terms of how I look at foreign policy is that it is a constant reminder that there are people on the other end of policy decisions, that there are real implications for real people's lives based on the choices that people like me and my colleagues make sometimes many thousands of miles away. As a journalist, you see that up close. You interact with those people day in, day out. In government, you're often removed, in my view, too far removed sometimes, geographically and in other ways from those implications. But that experience is one that I have tried to take with me into the Situation Room and other places where decisions are made so that we often and always keep in mind the impact they'll have on real people's lives.
Well, John, thank you very much, and we wish you the best in your work and as you continue to strengthen the US-India relationship.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.